My name is Priscilla Searles, and I'm town historian. I came to Orange in 1960, I can't remember, 1960. My parents moved here in 1959. Orange at that point was a town of transition. It was divided between farming and a bedroom community. And that was really the start of a change in the atmosphere in Orange that was really the beginning of the end for most of the farms. A few remained, but most of them didn't. And Orange was very careful about the town at that point. I admire them for making sure that lots at that point had to be 3/4 of an acre, because otherwise we'd be living on top of each other. Over the years that's expanded in size, but that's the forward thinking of the people that were in charge at that point. Otherwise, Orange would be very heavily overpopulated, and I think that's one of the nice parts about Orange is nothing is too close to each other, and we maintain that sort of half country, half city atmosphere. We're close to the city, but we're not city. And I started to work for the Journal Courier as a correspondent or a reporter, and that's how I really got to know what was going on in Orange and got to know the makeup of the town. I didn't know anything about, I knew nobody here because my parents had moved here when I was in college, and I came here right out of college and didn't know a soul. I will say that New England is a little bit standoffish when it comes to meeting people. My mother made a joke about the fact that it was 6 months before the man next door said, "Good morning, Mrs. Burgess." So, coming from the Midwest, I was born in Connecticut, but moved around a lot, so I do understand that New Englanders can be very standoffish initially, but they're very much on your side once you get to know them. Orange was quite different in those days. A lot of nonprofit organizations like there is now, but different kind of organizations. For instance, there was an organization, the JCs, and that was a very big thing in the 1960s. And almost everybody that was up and coming that I knew was in the JCs, and we had a branch called the JC Wives. I was president of it for a while. That kind of organization has changed. I think the biggest change was that I was the only woman that I knew with children that worked. None of my female friends worked, and that's not true now, so that's changed the kind of organizations that you have now. There was another one, Orangewood Women's Club, and that, I don't think that one exists anymore either. I'm not sure about that, but I don't think it does. But that was a huge organization, and both organizations did a lot of work for the benefit of Orange. So I think they've been replaced by things like groups like the Lions Club and the Rotary Club and various groups like that that weren't very active in those early days of Orange. When the Bicentennial came along, that was hatched in Walt Vesputa's living room, and it was the idea of the original 4-H'ers that had been active in 4-H in the 50s. And I was the token non-4-H'er. I think they wanted me there because I was a reporter, and they thought that at some point that might be beneficial. And it was the Vesputas and Rolly Hine and Helen and Jim Ewan. And it was started as, let's repeat all of the outside activities that we did during the 4-H events. They really didn't think about the inside events like, or I should say exhibits like the arts and crafts and photography. In the end, they said to me, well, why don't you do that and we'll take care of everything else. They honestly didn't believe that anybody would show up for inside exhibits. And we did it at Mary L. Tracy's school. We used the gymnasium for the inside exhibits. So the first year, much to their surprise, we had 800 exhibits. I had 800 exhibits, and I realized quite quickly that this was going to become much bigger than they anticipated. So out of that, I asked people that I knew to take over, you take over photography and we'll separate it out, and they separated out a number of different exhibits, which ultimately led to the way it is today on the fairgrounds. It's basically the same exhibits and categories that came out of that first year. I can remember one woman bringing in, it was pouring rain the night that everybody was bringing in their entries, and one woman brought in a milk can. And she said it's wet, and I thought she meant because of the rain. What she meant is she just finished painting it black, and when I picked it up, my hands were black. She neglected to tell me she meant the paint was wet, not the rain had made it wet. That was a lesson. That first year, I asked a lot of people, if craftspeople, if they would come for free, and I would, if they came for free, they could sell their product if they demonstrated how to make it. And we got some very unusual people that first year. I wish they still did that, because we had people that, we had a coppersmith, we had a woman who did spinning, and she did it on the lawn in back of Mary L. Tracy School, but she also raised her own sheep, so she walked the whole process through, and it was all craftsmen like that. I missed that part of the fair. It's become so big that they don't do that, and we get more commercial people than we do. Yeah, and I never paid them, and that was the deal. Mm-hmm. You come for free, and I let you sell your product if you want to do that. That first year also, we had sheep, and we had to, I say we, not me, the ex-4-Hers had sheep, and we had a very loose pen out in the back of Mary L. Tracy School. It was a flimsy fence, and one night, Bonnie Hine and I accidentally, very late at night, we let them loose, and they were all over the grounds in back of Mary L. Tracy School, at which point all of the gentlemen pulled up chairs and watched while they laughed to see how long it was going to take us to get those sheep back into the pen. Eventually we did, although I'm sorry, but sheep are not the smartest animals going, so it took a little encouraging to get them all back in, and everybody clapped when we got it done. That was like, thank you very much. Other things about the fair, the Sesquicentennial. The fair was a direct offshoot of the Sesquicentennial. There were a number of events that came out of that. That one remained with us. For the Sesquicentennial, there was a horse show, there was a carriage rally, there were a number of other events that were developed because of the Sesquicentennial. Of course, the Sesquicentennial celebration was very different than what we're doing now for the Bicentennial, because it was 1 week of non-stop activities. And at that point, I'd say that almost everybody in the town of Orange was involved with it at that point. It was a different atmosphere 50 years ago than it is now. It was really more town support for events like that, and I think people tended to know more people than they do now. It's not uncommon for you not to know who lives next door to you. That's just the nature of the time that we live in. But a lot of events came out of that. Some of the atmosphere in the fair in the first few years was very casual. I used to let my kids sleep out at the fairgrounds all night. And I wasn't there, but the neighbor across the street always slept there because he wanted to keep an eye on the animals that were in the livestock exhibit. And I didn't worry about the kids because in those days it was pretty safe and was somebody on the fairgrounds. And one night they went to sleep in the Conestoga wagon that we had constructed for the fair. And somebody came and hooked up a tractor to it in the middle of the night and took them on a ride all over Orange. And I thank you, our first selectman, Jim Zioli, because he was the one that did it. And he didn't tell me that until about a year ago. I'm reporting this story to him in his office, and he starts to laugh and goes, yeah, that was me. Thank you, Jim. When were you going to tell him you trucked my kids all over Orange? And then another time, the cows got loose, and it took forever to round them up, and they were missing one. And I seem to remember that one was tied up to a sign and at the front of the driveway to the police department down by the post road. How that cow got down there, I'll never know, but you never know with the animals if something happens. I guess that's why they have a permanent building now, because it's harder for them to escape than it was when they were in a tent. I think this house itself is kind of an example of how things have changed in Orange over the years. This house was built in 1861. The property had previously had another house on it owned by the Beechers, but this house was built by the Wades, and the Wades, Lottie Wade married a Peck at the turn of the century, so it basically stayed in the same family until 1945 when my father-in-law bought it. So basically it's had two owners in 160 years. It was originally this part of the farm was 175 acres, and there was an additional 40 acres that was across the street on the Indian Hill section, which was sold first, and the Wades sold the right-of-way for the trolley to go down Derby Avenue because they owned that property, and they sold the right-of-way to the trolley, which used to run down Derby Avenue from New Haven to Derby. One of the things that makes Orange unique that very few people don't think about, it's been unique from the beginning because if you go north, you have to go through Orange because the Post Road runs through Orange. The Merritt Parkway runs through Orange, and now we're talking before the Turnpike. If you wanted to go north, you went one of those two roads and you had to go north. The result was, at one point, Orange was rather famous for giving tickets to truckers that happened to go down the post road too fast, because the then chief of police, Carl Peterson, prided himself on his ability to trap them. And he was probably hated from coast to coast because everybody that was in the trucking business would warn, be careful when you go through Orange because that chief of police he's out there to get, and people tell me that he would hide and wait for them to go back, and that his great pride was in, when you go through Orange, you're going to go the traffic speed limit or I'm going to get you, and he did. I don't really know how to describe Orange now. I think Orange is like so many communities. It's in a transition period. We're still trying to hang on to some of the things that we did in the good old days, if you want to call it that. I think the fair is an example of that. The fair has changed in its appearance, and it's become, actually that fair is quite unique because that was strictly a volunteer effort. It wasn't town sponsored. We were independent of the town, and that made it very unique. We weren't putting out our hand to ask the town for money. We never did. We didn't have to. It was successful from the beginning. And I think that in itself makes it unique. There's still an effort to try to hang on to some of the feelings of the first couple of fairs. The museum that's located, I call it the Farmers Museum. The Farmers Museum, for lack of better terminology, is certainly a reflection of Orange the Orange of yesterday, and I think it's nice that it's there because it's a constant reminder that Orange was started off as a farm community. West Haven at one point was part of Orange. The heaviest population was, of course, on the West Haven side. This part of Orange was not heavily populated, but people don't realize that Orange and West Haven were together. That West Haven was part of Orange, not the other way around. West Haven would like to tell you it was the other way around, but it's not true. It wasn't. I really don't know what else I could say about Orange. It certainly remains a unique community in that it's low in crime. We have an excellent police department. We have a totally volunteer fire department. We don't pay any firemen, which I think is another rather unique situation in Connecticut. Even towns that have volunteer fire departments generally have some paid people, but we don't. And we don't need them because it runs quite well the way it is. People tell me, well, you don't have streetlights or sidewalks. Well, no, we don't, and I don't miss them. I lived in Chicago. I don't miss the streetlights I don't want to trade the streetlights and the sidewalks for what else comes with it. So I'm perfectly happy with no sidewalks. Don't need them. So I don't know what else you could say about Orange except that it's a very comfortable and nice and safe place to live. And I can't think of any place that would be safer or nicer or that I want to be any other place but here. So.
Excellent. Priscilla, can I take you back? You did a beautiful job bringing us all the way through Orange, but can I take you back and can you share with us about your husband and what he did and then your own family?
My husband grew up in Orange. His parents came here in 1944, and he was a kid, obviously. I think he was 9 or something like that. He went to the Orange Center School, which later became Mary L. Tracy School. Mary L. Tracy was a fixture in Orange as principal of the school, and ultimately the school was named after her. In those days, there were no houses behind us. It was completely open. Jim talked about riding horseback back there because there were no houses back there in those days. This had been part of the farm, the Wade farm. All of that property was for sale then. I can remember Jim's father telling me in 1944 he paid $5,000 for this house in the lot next door.
Wow.
Which was like, wow. Those days are gone forever, that's for sure. Jim grew up with a lot of the people that were being interviewed for this presentation that you're doing. He ultimately, when he was 17, he went to work for the police department as a photographer. Part-time, obviously, he was still in school. And at 19, he became a member of the police department, the youngest police officer in the state of Connecticut. There were all kinds of news releases written about that. He'll hold that record forever because you have to be 21 now, so nobody's going to beat him out of that. And he was in the police department for 26 years, retiring as assistant chief. And he was one of the people that wanted to get the fair going with others that had been involved in the 4-H. He was very involved in 4-H. His mother actually conducted some 4-H classes here in this house. And the farm itself, prior to when Jim's father bought it, when it was being farmed, it was primarily a seed farm. There were some cows and other livestock but it wasn't their principal reason for, it wasn't the way they made their living. It was the seed that they did. And they also grew a lot of other produce, vegetables primarily, that they sold, but it was the seed that was their primary means of earning a living. And the barn that they had, as a result, was massive and a huge stone foundation. The stone foundation still exists. And with a huge stone ramp that went up to the second floor, where they could drive the teams up with the seed. When you look at it and you think of when they built it, you wonder how they engineered it without modern equipment, because it's astounding how they put the stones together and make it work with none of the modern equipment that we have. I still am amazed at the way that they constructed things. This house, according to my son, is very over-engineered. I'm grateful for that. Otherwise, every doorway in a house that's 160 years old would be drooping, or the floors would be slanted on one direction. Mm-hmm. So thank you, whoever built this house, because I'm glad you over-engineered it. So I don't have to go. I have been in houses where if you put a marble on one side of the floor, it will roll to the other side of the room. And you can't do that in this house because the floors are still pretty level. So thank you, whoever built this house. I appreciate the effort.
Well, in my house, it was a great way for my kids to play by themselves. They could roll the ball out and it would roll back to them.
Yeah, I get that. I can't say that the doors don't stick once in a while, so there's a little bit of settling, but it's not. I think I can live with that one.
That's great. So Jim stayed on as a police officer, and then he retired from the
Yes, and then he
department.
went to work for the state of Connecticut as a bail commissioner. He worked placing, people don't understand what a bail commissioner is. When the prisoners were brought into the lockup in New Haven, he would decide whether they were going home on a PTA or promise to appear, or whether he's going to put a cash bond on them, or whether he was going to say, no, you're not going anywhere, you're sticking around. And that's what he did after he left the police department.
Wow.
The chief of police in New Haven came out and asked him if he would take that job, because the police department has to work with them, and the bail commissioner works for the state, not the police department. So the chief of police knew Jim. He had been in the class. Jim was in the first police science class from the University of New Haven, with a lot of people that became very Ben DeLito, and there were a lot of people that were in that class. Not Ben DeLito, I don't mean Ben DeLito. Yes, I do mean Ben DeLito. He was in Jim's class. And that's how he ended up in New Haven.
That's great.
Yeah, Jim, when he retired, well, before he retired, he owned a business on the post road called Wood Burners, and he sold stoves and did sharpening. He himself didn't work in there during the day. He was in the police department, but we had somebody a manager that worked there during the day,
Nice.
and we had that for a long time. That building has now been torn down. I've forgotten what's there now, but it was on the post road, and we had it for quite a long time. And then he moved the sharpening business here, and then ultimately got out of it. But in those days, I don't know any police officer that didn't have another side job. The pay was terrible, and if you wanted to eat, you had to have another job.
True.
It was like another job or no to eat. So yeah, nobody went into police work because of the pay, that's for sure.
Oh my gosh.
It's not as bad anymore, but it was pretty bad in those days.
Definitely. And Priscilla, I know your son Kevin lives in town,
Yes,
right? And
Yes.
do you have other children?
I have another son. I have an older son, Keith, who lives in New Hampshire, and I have two stepchildren. I'm very close to my stepdaughter, Susan. She lives in Wilton, and she has started her own business, which is now, she owns a business called The Painted Cookie.
Ooh.
And she's a nut-free bakery, and she does the most intricate, fancy cookies designs of sugar cookies you've ever seen. She's just brilliant, and now that she ships all over the country now.
Awesome.
It started in her kitchen, and now she has like 6 people working for her. So
Oh, that's exciting.
it's like, well, wow.
Now, these cottage industries, as I think they used to call them, have just blossomed so
Yeah.
much. And I think good for her.
Yeah, smart lady. Her mother didn't think she was college material. I'm being kind now, and I said she was, and ultimately she paid her way through Norwalk Community College, and doing it nights, and working full time during the day. And she was married at this point, and I give her a lot of credit for doing it. It's very tough to do it that way, very tough. But she's proved to be. She's a marketing master. I owned marketing companies over the years. I've had a lot of different variety of jobs. I was a corporate editor for the Armstrong Rubber Company when it was a Fortune 500 company. I was the youngest industrial editor in the country, working for a Ford. And what I don't know about marketing would shame me when I look at Susan, because she just knows how to do it. I think that's a gift from God. You don't learn that in college. You just have an instinct for it.
Good for her.
And I have another stepchild, David, Susan's younger brother, and he lives in Darien. So
Nice.
4, and I have 5 grandchildren.
Very, very nice. Good.
Don't know what else I can say about that.
Now, I'm telling you, it was great. Do you have questions, Lauren?
I wanted to like go back to the post road when we were talking, because you were saying how your husband had a business on the post road, and I thought that would be a good moment to segue into talking about maybe some other buildings that you remember on the post road or businesses. We were talking about the halfway house before, so, and a few other people have mentioned that. So if you wanted to explain that.
The halfway house is interesting because on the first day of my job at the Journal Courier, they sent me out to the halfway house, which was about to be torn down. And unfortunately, they sent me with a photographer. I regret that because I wished I'd done my own photography, because when the Journal Courier or the New Haven Register took the photographs, you didn't get them. If I'd taken them myself, I'd have that photograph. And I was fascinated with the pure mass of the building, considering the time frame. I'm not quite sure when it was built, but it was certainly in its heyday. You could tell that it was a really magnificent building. And as I said, they were about to take it down. It was on the post road on the corner of Racebrook Road. It was on the corner of Racebrook Road. I often wondered whether they had tried to save architectural details from that house, because it was that kind of house that it wasn't safe to go into it. When I saw it, we weren't allowed to go into it because they were going to take it down. But I always wondered whether there were architectural details in that house that could have been saved. I have no idea if anybody tried to. But the post road was the main way of going north. So it's not surprising that building, the halfway house, should have survived in such a rural area, because if you were going north, you had to go in the old days, that's the way you went. You had to go on the post road. There was no other way. And so there were a lot of halfway houses scattered along the route of the post road, where people traveling would stop, spend the night. They almost always had a tavern in them. And they were quite busy because of the traffic going back and forth. The other roads in Connecticut are primarily, a lot of them are old Indian trails, because the Indians in this area walked. They didn't have horses. And they developed pathways through Connecticut that ultimately became a lot of the roads that we use today. They were Algonquins, and no, they didn't sleep in teepees, and that's only on the Late Late Show on TV.
Right.
don't have any. Wigwams
Right.
were an interesting construction, not anything like a teepee. Actually, they were quite an engineering feat. Almost like they looked like a wooden version of the World War II Quonset huts. So it's like, I gotta look at that. And there were a lot of Indians in this area. Actually, Ralph M. Arman, who was then town clerk, studied them, and there were many, many, many tribes in Connecticut, in Orange. I didn't realize that. But he had to study them, and Tracy Van Arman is a brilliant artist.
She does a beautiful job.
I commissioned her to do a picture of my horse, Spider.
Nice.
Spider, I didn't name my horse Spider. That was her name when she arrived. We bought her when she was 2, so she was only greenbroke, meaning she'd only had a saddle on her once, and but she was a quick study. She was half Arabian and half quarter horse, and let's just say she was feisty. And I was the only one. She'd start, jumping around the corral, and I'd just say, not proper terminology for our horse. I'd go, so knock it off, Spider, and she would, but that was me. But she got loose one day, and on a Sunday, and it was in the summertime. She got loose several times. This particular day, it was in the middle of the day, and she ran down Bittersweet Drive and around the whole neighborhood, and because it was so warm, a lot of people had their windows open, and she stuck her head in so many windows, and to this day I don't understand it, because not one single person called the police. Now, if a horse stuck their head in my window, I'd pick up the phone and say, guess what, there's a horse running around the neighborhood, but nobody, they just went, it's Searles' horse. Okay. She always came back. I'd wave a little feed at her, and she could not resist, and she'd follow the feed home. The other horse was a Morgan, and a beautiful horse, but very shy. And the only way you could get her home, see, Spider could let herself out of the stall until I got smart and changed where the lock was. And then she could let the other one out, too. She let herself out, and then she let the other one out. And the only way you could get the other one home was she would follow Spider no matter where Spider went. So you sort of pretended you didn't notice that there was another horse behind Spider, and if you just led Spider into the barn, the other one would go, because she wanted to be where Spider was, which is a good thing, because I can't imagine catching Cassie running around the neighborhood. I'd still be running. And there's no way I'd ever catch her. That would never work. But
Goodness.
And various other animals. We used to get a lot of animals dumped on us because we'd take animals that were being abused or had been left. We had a goat. We got a police call from the West Haven Police Department asking us to take this goat because it was, in their opinion, not being treated well. And it turned out that the people had bought the goat for their child for Easter, but Easter was very early that year, and they put the goat outside thinking they don't have to feed him because they'll eat the grass. So this goat was, first of all, skinny and we had to fatten him up and we had to vet him, and I've never seen so many bugs on one animal in my life. We had to disinfect. We put him in the back of my car, and of course then my car had to be treated repeatedly to get rid of the bugs that were in it. I couldn't even drive it. And it turned out the goat really did have a nasty disposition. And one day I'm looking out the window, and Jim was leaning over picking rocks out of the corral, and you know how you know it's coming? And I went, where you want to say, and that goat hit him in the backside like, whoa. So the next day he's upstairs shaving, and I walk upstairs and I say, what are we going to do about that goat? And just as I said that, there's a knock on the door, and this Jamaican had all these goats on Russell Avenue.
There you go.
And he knocks on the door and he says, do you have a goat for sale? If I got a goat, I'm not even going to charge you. You can have him. Off he went down the street. The kids used to say they went over there to look to see if they could find him over there. But that was the rest of them. Pretty much, we'd keep them, and we had ducks and geese and the world's biggest supply of banty hens you've ever seen. The banty hens used to like to sleep on Spider's back. I always was angry at myself that I never got a picture because they would line up at night on her back. And one night, Jim and I went out to dinner, and we came back, and we realized there was an extra banty in there. Somebody, while we were out to dinner, had put another. People would drop them off, just so you never knew what you were going to find. And while we're standing there, the chickens lined up on Spider's back to go to, that's where they spent the night. And the new one got up there. And Spider realized that there was a stranger on her back, and she started to buck. Oh. And Jim and I went, oh, we're not even going to look, because we could hear them all clucking, and they all fell off, and we figured they were all going to be smashed. Then one by one they come out. And the next night we go out, and the new one's up there with the rest of them. So it just took one night of her getting bucked off, and then Spider decided, well, she's here to stay, so
that's great.
I can keep
That's
that
a
one.
good story.
And cats. Sometimes with the cats, people would, like one cat we had was put in a box on somebody's steps, and they called us up and said, please, we can't take the cat. And we had so many animals at that point, we never gave her an official name, we just called her Kitty. And she never grew full size because she was suffering from malnutrition so badly when we got her. And she lived to be 27.
Wow.
And she could jump from the fence, the corral fence, to the top of the barn where there's a little bit of opening in the hayloft, almost to the day she died. I could never understand how such a little animal could jump that far.
Good for her.
Yeah, and she was the kind of cat where you could have her inside or outside. That doesn't always work. So a lot of outside cats you can't have in the house, which she didn't care. But we had it was just a variety of animals. The geese turned out to be a challenge, though, because when we had Muscovy ducks, and they had baby ducks all the time. They were funny, and we had a rooster named Red who was tame, and the rooster would follow the baby ducks around and corral them if they got out of line or if they strayed off from the mother, because she usually had like 12 or 14 at a time, make sure none of them got lost. And that was funny, the way that rooster rode in. We went down to, there used to be a hardware store in Orange on the post road called Herman's. And Jim and I were going to do an errand one day, and we go and pull up in front of Herman's, and I went, I got bad news. Red's in the back of the pickup truck. He's come all the way down here. Jim goes, oh, whatever. He puts him in the cab and says, we'll just leave him here till we go home, because we didn't even notice. And he could have gotten away. He wasn't nothing. But he just wanted to go for a ride. We had another goat that was born across the street at John Sorensen's. He was big. He was 150 pounds. But he was housebroken from day one. And I used to come home from work, and he would be watching television with the two kids. He'd be in the TV room watching television. He loved to ride in the car or the truck. He didn't care. So you had to be careful if you opened the door, because if you did, he was going to be inside no matter what. And this happened to some friends of ours a couple of times. And I said, just drive him around the block. You're not going to get him out of the car until you take him for a ride. So just go around the block, and then he'll get out. He just wants to go for a ride. And I had to banish him from the house finally, because I made the mistake of having a dried flower arrangement in the middle of this table. And as he's going out, that was too much. He got out on the table, and I'm like, oh my gosh, he weighs 150 pounds, get him off my table. And the other one that I thought was funny was we had a raccoon that came here all the time. In fact, I had company for dinner one night, and I had different windows there. And the raccoon was watching us eat, and he had his hands up on the glass like this watching. And whoever was sitting here goes, and I went, oh, you're the raccoon? Well, I had 2 cats that got fed outside, and that raccoon wanted to be fed first. He'd come up and he'd eat the cat food. And it would be a scrabble between them all every night. And I thought, I'm staying out of this. I'm not, because I can't get rid of the raccoon, and the cats are just going to have to get used to it. And one night I came home from work, and all 3 of them are on the raccoon is in the middle, and there's a cat either side of them on one step, and all 3 of them are asleep.
Oh, how cute.
This is like, I guess they worked it out themselves. That's how they worked that one out.
Animals are incredible.
Yeah, I miss not having animals. You know, the last one I had was, at the time I was executive director of Fort Nathan Hill, and this cat had a kitten in the gun mount. And we had a fox that lived out there, and I thought, this isn't good. And so I took her home long before the mother was wild, they couldn't get near the mother. But I took the kitten home, and she thought I was her mother, because that cat never acted like a cat. She followed me everywhere. If I was on the couch, she had to be on the couch. She slept on my bed at night, and that was the challenge, because I never let my animals on the furniture. But with her, it was like, cats like to sleep up against you, and that's not acceptable, I'm sorry. But so I decided to get one of those terry cloth rolls that they use in the bathtub to keep behind your neck, and I put it between us. And for about 2 weeks, she would pick it up with her teeth and throw it off the bed, and I'd have to get up and put it back, and finally after 2 weeks, she gave up. That's your side, this is my side. Until the day she died, I had that thing in the middle. That's your territory. You're not sleeping on my neck.
Really, yeah. Animals give you a lot of love and
Yeah.
a lot of
I really miss that one. And she was a runt again, because she only weighed 6 pounds, which for a cat is nothing. But because she was born where she was, and to a stray cat,
Exactly.
she wasn't. And I like them little like that. Kevin's always finding them at work, and the first one he found, he put inside his shirt, because he works for UPS, and he had to drive around with it. And I went over there one day that they were away. I was supposed to feed them, and I picked up one of their cats, and I'm like, oh, this is what a real cat weighs? I was shocked, because this cat weighed like 14 or 15 pounds, and I was used to the 6-pounder. It was like, oh my gosh, this cat is a tank. And now other people tell me, oh, that's nothing. My cat weighs 20 pounds. Oh,
That's good.
That's
Do you have another question, Lauren? Or?
I do have one question. I was thinking when you were saying you were a reporter for Orange, you probably met a lot of people through that, and I was wondering if there was anyone that you met through that experience, or just throughout your experience living in Orange, that you connected with, that you had a special connection with.
No, well, I had a special connection with Bill Knight, first of all, because he was first selectman when I went to work for the Courier, and we became good friends. And he wanted me to do something I haven't done, and now I'm trying to do it now. I made him a promise many, many years ago, more than 50 years ago actually, that I would write the history of the volunteer fire department. And he would talk to me about it, and I'd take notes, and I'd come home, and I'd write out my own notes, and then I'd go back the next day and show them to him. And in the meantime, he's written out his notes, his opinion of what I should be saying, and I still have those same notes. I'm trying to wade through them now, because his grandchildren know I have those notes in his handwriting, and they want them, and I promised them when I was finished they could have them. And I ultimately, when I was divorced from my first husband, and I lived in Orange then too, and I rented an apartment in a two-family house that he owned that was part of Fairleigh Farms at one point. And he was the landlord. Bill owned it, but he didn't really want to rent it to me because his idea of renters was females can't fix anything, so I want a man. But the nights bugged him until he gave up. And he used to come over and try to fix things, and Kevin would follow him around, and Kevin would talk nonstop. And Bill told me that when he couldn't take it anymore, he'd turn his hearing aid off so he didn't have to listen to Kevin. And Kevin never had a clue. He just reached up, turn the hearing aid off so Kevin won't bug me. But Kevin is actually, when Kevin went with me, when I worked for the Courier, my oldest son, I would stay with a neighbor. There were no daycares in those days, and I couldn't afford it anyway, so it was a moot point. So Kevin, when he was 5 months old, when I went to work for the Courier, I carried him in a carrier. And I left him two places. I left him in the police department when he never cried ever, and I put the carrier in the corner, and I got in the car, and I was halfway home before I realized, oh, wait a minute, I brought Kevin with me, and he's still on the floor in the police department. And I went back, and there he was. And the other time I was visiting Armstrong Rubber Company, and the shipping department at Armstrong in those days was in West Haven. That's where their plant was. And the shipping department was part of the advertising department that I had worked in, and they saw me coming in with the carrier, and they wanted me to leave him downstairs so that they could play with him. Okay, so I put him in the middle. They had this big shipping table, and I put him in the middle of the table, and I'm going up to the executive floor to visit. And once again, I was halfway home, and I realized I'd left my kid in the shipping department at Armstrong Rubber Company, and maybe I ought to go back and get him. And he was still laughing, no problem. He doesn't remember this, but of course he continued to go with me even as a toddler. He's met 5 governors of the state of Connecticut without even realizing that he did. He doesn't know, but I said, yeah, Kevin, 5.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Pretty impressive.
Yeah. The fire department initially started off, I believe at one point they occupied the original train station that was on Orange Center Road. The Orange Center Road Firehouse is a WPA project, or was a WPA project. And there was I think it was brass, Bill Knight was the one that told me the story, a sign on the building that disappeared. And Bill always thought that it's going to show up someday in somebody's attic. There were lots of drives then for collecting metal, but Bill always believed that somebody took it because it was too hard to resist. And that someday it's going to show up in somebody's attic. I don't know whether it got donated to a metal drive or whether it's in somebody's attic, but I'm inclined to believe that Bill was right, that somebody swiped it.
Oh, hopefully it'll show up.
Yeah. The fire department, that building, I told you, Judy, that the fire department called me up and asked me if I had an early picture of that building, because the original building had double wooden doors that were quite low because the equipment wasn't very big. And they had to be altered over the years to accept more modern equipment. And in fact, today's equipment doesn't fit in there. The new ones have to be on the post road building because they just don't fit in that building. But the fire department didn't have a picture of the fire department, that building on Orange Center Road with the wooden doors. I was the only one that knew that would have one. And mine wasn't very good, but at least it showed what it was.
That's it.
In this whole project that you've taken on is the feeling of Orange today compared to the Orange of yesterday. And that's the most important thing that we have to get out of this. And out of that, we have to say, what have we been able to retain from the days of yesterday that still applies to today in Orange? And I think that's the one thing that Orange still does. Maybe it isn't the same as it was 50 years ago, but it still has that sense of small community, and I think they work at that.
I agree.
And that's to their credit.
Yeah, I agree. That and the volunteerism we still
Yeah.
have.
Yes,
Very strong.
definitely. The groups have changed. The same groups that I was talking about don't exist anymore, but they've been replaced by other groups. And yes, there's still a lot of volunteer groups. I think if we're weak anywhere, it's in finding a way to encourage new people in town to get involved, or finding a way to welcome them into town. I'm not sure that we do that properly yet. I think we need to work on it. I think we don't realize that if you come into Orange and you're a new resident and you don't know anybody, you have no way of knowing how to connect with people in town.
Right. We used to have a welcoming committee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but we don't have that anymore. I think in that sense, there are some gaps that we could still work on in that department, because people are more leery now of meeting other people than they were 50 years ago. A lot has changed in the last 50 years.
Right.
And that's one of the things that has changed. So it's not uncommon for people to move into a town, work someplace else, and not know anybody in the town that they're living in. They sleep here. And yes, I said it was turning into a bedroom community, in 1960, but there was still an effort to know your neighbors, and that's disappeared.
Yeah.
We don't do that anymore.
I think it's a sign of the times, unfortunately, but I think
Yeah.
I think we're heads above some of our other neighboring
Oh,
towns.
yes. I wouldn't. Some of the towns are too isolated for me. You're 5 minutes from I'm 5 minutes from New Haven. I don't want to live in New Haven, but I want to be close to it. I want to have the benefits that they can give me without living there. The museums and the culture. We don't need to have an opera house or a theater here. We have all of that in New Haven, just a few minutes away. It's easy to go to New York from here. It's even easy to go to Boston from here. My brother lives outside of Boston on the North Shore. Comes down here all the time. It's nothing. So Orange has the unique situation where it's quite close to all of civilization, but it's not on top of it. Where some of the other communities in Connecticut are too isolated, and I wouldn't want to live in those. I like being near the bigger centers without living in them.